to Simpler. We are three pastors, husbands, and fathers on a journey to make life simpler by holding Jesus as the core for every belief and practice. This journey has shaped us to be more like Christ, freed us from the shame of failure, and encouraged us to a deeper love of our Lord and God. We invite you to join us in the discussions that have shaped and continue to shape our lives.
So it's interesting because I heard a preacher recently say on one of the hundreds of videos I've been watching lately, but he said every message should culminate in Christ. And he goes, and if it doesn't, it is a poorly preached text. So like even if you're preaching the Old Testament and it doesn't point to Jesus, he goes, you've misrepresented the text. And I loved it. And I was like, heck yeah. And so why would our instruction or our teaching about Satan be different than that?
Yeah.
Why would we take it outside of the story of Christ?
Absolutely.
And so just a thought that I had.
I'm in agreement.
I like it. All right.
I like it. You know what else I like, Ryan?
You like me?
I like Fifth Tuesdays, man.
Oof.
So this is the fifth Tuesday of October. Happy Fall Festival, Fall Fellowship, Halloween, Harvest Festival, whatever you celebrate today, whatever it looks like.
Hallows Eve.
Hallows Eve. Happy end of October into November, which is crazy. Like we were wrapping up this year. We're
joking about that, by the way. We don't celebrate.
We don't celebrate that. Just making jokes about this time of year. Everybody shut up, calm down. This crap pisses me off.
Just go run through a corn maze and go buy some pumpkins.
That's right, dude. Going to corn maze.
Yeah, I can't believe we're at November.
It's so crazy. Like it just flies, dude. You reach this point of the year. It's like school starts and you just fly straight to this last semester of the year, which is crazy. Last half of the year. So anyway, Fifth Tuesday, and what we do on Fifth Tuesdays, if you're new to the podcast, we just jump right into a discussion that we've probably discussed aspects of before, but we haven't discussed in preparation for like a podcast, and we haven't centered on a simpler view or things like that. We're just going to jump into the discussion. And so as this is helpful for you guys who have been with us for a long time, being able to see, well, how do the conversations kind of work behind closed doors? How did we hear the podcast, we hear the prepared discussions. What does it look like for you guys just to talk about a topic? And so we're inviting you into that, and you guys get to be a part of that now. And as I've never done this before, but I want to encourage you that as we go through the conversation, if something pops up in your mind, jot it down, make a note of it, and then send us messages. And if we don't address that or whatever, send us a message on Instagram or Facebook so we can just make the conversation wider than us three, make it be a part of the simpler community. So, Ryan, all that being said, what is the topic for today?
A couple of months ago, Micah just said, one of these days for a Fifth Tuesday, I would like to talk about church planting. And
I said that?
Yep. And
That's a good idea, man.
And that I know he's funny like that because he doesn't remember those things. The other day, he and I were talking about something unrelated to church planting, about how to handle some financial needs in the church, whatever, or outside the church. People who were coming to the church going, "Hey, I have this need.
Yeah.
Can your church help?" And he was like, "Hey, how should we handle it?" And I said, "Well, what you suggested that we do 2 years ago is blah 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 blah." And no, I said, well, what we had talked about before was blah, 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 blah. And he goes, man, that's a great idea. I was like, it was your idea. And it was like, oh, okay. I was like,
dude, that's amazing.
Yeah. He's like, that sounds like something I would have said.
Yeah.
Well, it was.
It was.
I never heard back from that person, by the way.
Okay. I didn't figure.
Yeah. Interesting. So you had mentioned, Micah, that it'd be interesting to talk about church planting from a biblical perspective and a modern perspective and how they compare. And so one of the things that you had said specifically was, where do we get this idea that churches are supposed to plant other churches? And I think was the question that you had posed, because a lot of churches plant other churches, which I am not going to say at the outset that that's a bad thing.
No, I'm not opposed to that at all.
So your question was, we should talk about church planting, biblical compared to modern day, and why do churches feel the need to plant other churches? Is that a biblical model? That's kind of your framework for this conversation.
Okay.
And I will begin the conversation by saying I take no issue with churches planting other churches.
Nope.
I don't know that we can say it's a biblical mandate. The first thing that comes to mind for me is in Acts 13, where Barnabas has by this point already gone into Antioch, and he has been working there. There was such a need for effective ministry to be done there. He travels over to Tarsus, gets Paul, brings Paul back. They both are in Antioch now, and they become two of several elders in Antioch who are discipling and training up Christians. And then the elders get together and they pray about which of them should go out and proclaim Jesus more. And Paul and Barnabas are selected, and their hands are laid on them, and then they go on their first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas and preach Christ. And after they make this circuitous trek, they come back through all those places and appoint elders, those who are recognized culturally and those who are recognized. It would be hard to say that they're super biblically mature, because at this point they've been believers for a very short amount of time. But those who have taken hold of the faith.
Well, we could even say, I think that we could say they're probably mature, because Paul's instruction to Timothy of who to appoint.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
These are men who are also able to teach, and then they fit these qualifications.
So these are people who got it. Probably a lot like Paul did, who knew the scriptures
fairly quick. Yeah.
And so they go back through these cities and appoint elders who will then be foundational in teaching these people. And so we would say that Paul and Barnabas essentially established churches.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the times that Paul would go and do ministry, I think of when he meets Lydia, who he meets her, and there's a group of women praying by the river. That's where they would do their laundry. And then she takes them into her house, and there's a church that's developed there. We see a church that meets in Priscilla and Aquila's house. But it feels like in the first century, these were very organic.
Yeah.
So you had people who were elders in their community, were people who knew the Lord, who had come to understand the things of faith.
What do you mean, elders in their community?
Well, so like...
Are you saying elders, or is that a different usage of the word elders?
No, I mean like spiritual elders. Like Jason in Thessalonica was someone who clearly understood the gospel, and eventually there was a church that met at Jason's house. So
right. Okay.
These were people... It's not like...
You're using it in the same context.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
I thought maybe you were talking about like...
old people.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. But there was... You don't see Paul go, hey, Jason, what if we started a church at your house? When Paul had preached for a few weeks in Thessalonica and was run out of the synagogue, Jason was like, well, man, come to my house. Like, let's continue this.
Yeah.
And then when Paul left, Jason was persecuted, but then it appears that there was a community of believers that kind of circled around Jason. Like he's the guy. So I would argue that Paul and Barnabas are planting churches, but it seemed very organic.
Almost like out of a need.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than like a necessity, like
a need instead of a necessity.
Sorry, that was
What's funny is I knew exactly what you meant. I was like, yes.
need instead of a mandate.
Yeah. It was a need, but not a necessity.
I guess that could be true, but that's not what I meant.
No, it's just funny. But these are people who, I mean, they welcomed Paul into his home, so into their homes, and then those people continued to teach and disciple and train.
So we wouldn't take, we're obviously not going to take a one-to-one correlation with that, because we're not opposed to church buildings.
Well,
obviously,
no,
or building one.
But what's interesting in the book that I've been reading on kind of the history of the church is that in terms of archaeological finds, there's not really evidence of buildings until the very end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century. And most of those are even later. Most of them are 4th or 5th century.
Is that post-Constantine or pre-Constantine?
It's post.
Okay, that makes sense.
Well, it totally makes sense because, and one of the arguments, so there's almost zero archaeological finds, and I think I mentioned this before in a previous podcast, but maybe I was talking to Michelle about it. There's almost zero archaeological finds in terms of mosaics or art or stuff like that until about 180 AD. And part of that is because most of the people who were putting their faith in Christ the first 150 years were of low means, so they can't afford to put a big mosaic in their floor. And 2, they were being persecuted. They were being fed to the lions. So you're not going to put a big Christian mosaic in the middle of your floor.
Like, hey, that makes more sense than the means, because there are obviously people with means that...
like Barnabas or whatever.
Priscilla and Aquila. So like, it makes more sense that you wouldn't put a big poster up in your house like, hey, I'm a follower of Jesus, come kill me.
Right. And so what's interesting is for the first couple hundred years of Christianity, it was these house churches.
Yeah.
And so I don't even know that we can look at the biblical model of church and compare it to what we do today.
Right. You just wouldn't make a one-to-one correlation.
You can't. Our church model today looks more like the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. And so,
which is an interesting point because there's so many things in even within our worship services.
Sorry. Our Western church model looks more like 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. You go into some of these villages in India and stuff, and that does look like.
Okay. But I think there's a lot of Eastern that looks the same way as well. Eastern Orthodox, and you're just talking about it's not everywhere. It's
right.
Some
of the 1st century house churches, those things still thrive throughout the world.
Yeah. And I think to be fair, we would say we're not opposed to the idea of house churches either.
No, not at all.
There's, to your point about the villages in India, like there are places in the world where that actually makes a lot more sense than having like a big gathering spot where it's like an actual building, even if it's not owned by the assembly gathering. But it makes more sense to meet in churches or places where it's illegal to be a Christian, like China and places in Southeast Asia and the Middle East where people are hiding to get together for worship. What's interesting to me is that I hadn't thought about this. The way we do our worship services now probably is correlated to later than the early churches. Like we don't know what they sang. He said, I mean, he mentions
singing
psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Like we know that there was these things that went on, like singing, but we don't know what the format was for that. So I think I'll say this up front. One thought is I think it'd be dangerous to try to make a one-to-one correlation in that regards, because it's difficult to do it exactly like they did it.
Well, and I would argue that the form of most churches, even probably a lot of the house churches, because even when I was in India, 23 years old, even though there were like 30 of us in a grass hut, the structure of it was almost identical to what we do now in terms of sing a few songs, and then there was a teaching, and then they took up a little offering or whatever, you know, like the form was still almost the same. And a lot of that, I do think, I'm not far enough into the book to tell you, but I think what's been implied so far is a lot of that did come out of kind of Constantine's kind of
institutionalization of the church.
Yeah. So I
Plus
think
the early church seemed to have met a lot more often.
Yes. Yeah. So I think if we're going to plant a church, I think that the form has to factor as less important to us than the content of Christ.
100% agree.
But I think a lot of people put a lot of emphasis in church planting on the form. And I feel like that it's not necessarily problematic, but could be.
Yeah.
And so, and I haven't been on a ton of mission trips. I've been on a few, and I've been overseas a few times. And it is interesting to me, the times that I haven't gone by myself, it's interesting to me how Americans often have the view going into India or Indonesia or something like that. They're like, well, we want you to do it the way we're doing it back home. And I'm like, why? But like, why are we trying to get them to do it the way we did it back home?
I think that's a struggle in this conversation is like obviously us three we want to be biblical in what we do, but I think this is a conversation where people try to make correlations that aren't necessarily meant to be correlations for us now. You know, like I've heard people teach Acts 2 when all these Jews get saved who've come from all over the world as if like this is how you have to do church. The difficulty is it says at the end of that section, I forget what verses it is, about them like listening to the apostles' teaching, breaking bread, prayer, gathering, these kind of things, that at the end of that it says, and they met in the synagogue daily.
Right.
So like, why teach the whole first section and then tell everybody, but you don't have to meet in the synagogue? So I don't think the implication is it's got to be a one-to-one correlation. I think you can say these are great things to implement for community, for us. Like these are like things that are really beneficial for us. But man, to make it a rule, that's difficult because now you got to say we got to find a synagogue to go to.
Yeah. Well, and you and I talked about that recently, that a lot of the churches, there were house churches, but a lot of the Christians early on did meet in the synagogues.
Or at least we know some.
Yeah. There are places where that's pictured for us.
Yep.
And so like...
we would say, I mean, we have a difficult time saying that was the houses.
True. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I think it was probably, you've pointed this out before, and it's fair that seemingly the first place Paul went when he entered a town was a synagogue.
Yeah.
It's a meeting place. So he's preaching the gospel to these Jews who are in these foreign nations, but they're meeting, they're coming to worship as Jews.
Yeah.
And he goes in because it's comfortable for him.
Yep.
And he tells them about Jesus, and seemingly some of these people are getting saved.
Well, there was, it's Jesus in Luke 4 being handed the scroll of Isaiah and preaching in a synagogue. Paul would go and do that. And he and Barnabas were recognized as teachers, and they would be brought in, and like...
It's genius.
It's super smart.
Because he didn't go in and like like an area where they didn't know him.
Well,
Even like Mars Hill, you could tell how hard it was for him to speak to these Greeks in Mars Hill.
Yep.
He's having to be very vague, like, oh, I know who that God is that you say doesn't have a name. Like that's genius, but like he can go into a synagogue and just be like, let me tell you everything about Jesus from the Old Testament.
Yep. Yeah. So church planting, why hasn't the 456 planted a church?
Why haven't we planted a church?
Because we were like 50 people forever.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So can we go before that?
Yeah, go.
I don't know where the mandate would come from, which is what I meant earlier instead of necessity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The mandate would be for the planting of a church to plant another church.
Mm-hmm.
Caveat to that, I'm not opposed to a church planting another church.
Yeah.
I just don't understand where the mandate is. Like a successful church has to plant another church.
Right.
It feels to me like there were these gatherings of saints, gatherings of believers out of necessity because they needed to gather together.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's no place to gather, you create a gathering. If there's no spot to gather, someone with a house is like, I'm assuming someone who's wealthy enough to have a house like that, big enough, is like, come eat at my house. So seems to me like it was born out of necessity, rather than a mandate.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't have a problem like taking that perspective, like that church planning could be done out of a necessity rather than a mandate.
Do you think? I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I think the answer is yes, but you guys are welcome to disagree.
Wow.
Do you think that because a lot of churches regard church planting as a mandate, or I think as a badge of honor, that they hurriedly put people in place of elders that aren't qualified yet? You know what I mean? Like
Explain what you mean by that.
I think Church A says, hey, look, we want to plant a church in this city over there, and they send out 2 or 3 people to go over there. They commission some people to go over there and plant this church. I don't know that the people who, I feel like sometimes that process is rushed, and the people they send to plant the church aren't called or equipped. So like
qualified, maybe?
Yeah, they're not qualified.
They're capable of doing the form.
Yeah, you can recreate the form. So, like, I've seen it, and you guys have seen it, where I haven't seen it often, but every now and then you'll see a church host a preaching conference that's supposed to equip you to be able to be a preacher. It's not a conference for people who are teachers. Mm-hmm. It is a conference to enable you to be a teacher, which can be beneficial.
Yeah, if it's a catalyst for people who are able to teach.
But I think that sometimes people will go to those kinds of things and then they come away and they're like, okay, I'm a pastor now, I'm a teacher now,
we
I'm
know
an overseer.
Someone close to us that planted a church here in San Angelo, but said, I don't feel like I'm qualified to teach.
Yes. Yeah.
So like, how in the heck do you plan on being someone who, like Paul specifically told Timothy, the things you've heard me say, entrust to faithful men who are also able to teach.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and even the qualification of the overseers, they must be able to teach.
Yeah. And we're not talking, I don't feel like the implication of that is they have to be an eloquent preacher.
No.
I'm talking about like someone who's able to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. Mm-hmm. Someone who's able to take the scripture and say, let me teach you, who can take, if you will, Acts 2, the apostles' teachings and Paul's letters and say, let me show you Jesus from this for the benefit of, like, I'm not talking about being an eloquent speaker.
No.
There's a lot of eloquent speakers that are not good teachers.
Yeah. People who can correctly represent the gospel from the scripture and do that clearly. Like, it doesn't
I feel like that's the implication in what Paul's telling Timothy. So I'm not trying to put my own definition on that. I'm just pointing out, I think our mindset of what a teacher is probably much different than what Paul means here.
Yes.
When he says to Timothy, entrust these things to faithful men who are also able to teach. I also think one of the problems we see in churches in general, at least in my experience, I'll say it this way. My experience is we make an academic education and theology the basis by which we trust someone to be in a position of leadership within a local body.
Yeah.
And I don't think it implies that. I think someone who is not an Ephesians 4 or 2 Timothy or Timothy and Titus person, or someone that's not qualified to be an overseer, can get an academic education in theology and go be a leader at a church, be a pastor, be an overseer, be an elder, like whatever you want to call it, depending on your context. I think that they could do that. And I think that's what we see is we see all these people who come into these churches who have an academic training, but probably are not people that Paul's talking about when he tells Timothy to train these men. So like in their mind, it's like in a church's mind, this guy has a degree, therefore he must be qualified for this.
Right.
And I don't think that's the case. You know what's funny? Little tangent real quick. I've been getting so many questions lately about our leadership structure. And it's sometimes I think the questions, it's not people from our church that are asking me this. People outside the church, they're maybe it's because we're younger. I know you're not super young anymore, Ryan, but like because
Dude,
we're
you're in your 40s now. I mean, like
because we're younger, the assumption they have is that if we don't have someone outside the three of us that has an academic education to help us lead, that we're incapable of it. And it's actually starting to piss me off a little bit.
How are these questions coming up?
Because I'm out and talking about because I tell people about our leadership structure.
Yeah.
And it's funny to me that they're like, I almost feel like.
So they just go, which one of you has a seminary degree?
Something like that. Or like, do y'all have someone else that you're like accountable to? And I'm like, like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like, are you asking if there's someone who's formally trained academically in theology that we ask questions to and ask questions of? Is that what, I don't know what people, like, the people who know us know that the reason we did our leadership structure the way we did it was for the accountability's sake. So
it's super funny because most like Baptist churches or Protestant churches, well, let me not say most. Many of them operate with the teaching pastor as the head over everything.
The senior pastor, the lead pastor.
So who's he accountable to?
Well, here's the crazy thing is they'll say, well, they've got the deacons. Well, the deacons they have at those churches aren't qualified
to be deacons.
Most of them, some of them probably are, but most of them are not that I've met.
And they're operating not as deacons.
Right, and so the accountability, the question mark is the accountability that we lack, according to these people, is a group of people who are not qualified to be in a leadership position. And that's the accountability that you'd be comfortable with. This is what I'm talking about when I'm like, I have a hard time being patient with this because you're asking me a question, not from a biblical perspective, but from a cultural, traditional perspective. And listen, I get it. If you're listening and you're an educated person and you have a hard time sitting under people who don't have the same academic education, go to a different church. I don't know how to say that any better. Like if that's a problem, go somewhere else. If you're looking for somewhere to be like the 456, who's going to be people who teach the scriptures, who their life rests on Jesus, and we do life together in community, we would love for you to come. But listen, if you're gonna like try to rip us apart because of accolades, you need to come at me because I'm going to rip you to shreds. Honestly, me and you, I'll just say this. I think me and you could probably take on most people in a theological conversation. If we're together. I don't think I could by myself.
Whatever.
Because because you know the scripture like I do. I mean, I think Pierce and I could ask a lot of good conversational questions, but I think without your like biblical basis. So like if you and I were together in a conversation, I think you know what? It's true because you and I have had conversations with lots of doctors of theology, and they're good conversations because I understand that our heart is the scriptures. Our heart's not the. But anyways, to your point, it just got me in a tangent because
I can tell.
Sorry. The idea of church planning is not based on people's qualifications for leadership. It's based on the form, and it's starting to make me sick. Like my accolade as a church that planted a church is that I had someone who's really good at singing and possibly good at leading worship, and we send them to a church. Oh, here's what it is. We send them to a church. And we're not really comfortable with them being in leadership. So what we say is this is a satellite campus. You're the campus pastor, but you don't get to teach people. I'm going to put my face up on a screen every week, and you're going to be the person that's the contact person to make sure the organizational administrative structure of this little group works. Yeah. But then I'm going to be on the screen teaching. Like, I'm not going to say that's wrong, but it's stupid. It's dumb.
Yeah, it's strange.
It's like, why plant? Or like, why have another? Okay, if it's a space issue, then fix the space issue, but don't call it another campus. Like, call it part of the same thing. I don't mind the structure if you're like, this is because of we don't have enough space and we want more people to come. But the moment you say like we're planning a church, but we're not actually sending people who are leadership qualified, you're not planning a church.
You just have another place.
You're not following the pattern of Paul and Timothy. And that's where my struggle is with this idea of like accolades and church planning is so many people are planting because they don't like the way things were at another church, or
that's a big point,
or they feel like they want to do something a different way. Yeah. Man, when we talked about planning, we had these conversations. Yeah. Like, why do we feel the draw to this? And what we came to is we realized that there was a need we feel like that we could have met, that we're trying to meet now. And I'm not going to go into all those needs, but we talked about that. This wasn't just us saying we wish things were done differently. Right. Because if we're being honest, the way the 456 now is probably not the way that I would prefer it as far as form.
The way that we are right now?
Yeah. I mean, you're probably in the same camp as me, Pierce. Like I probably would have gone to the Northwest and started a church in a bar.
Oh,
you know what I mean? Like
yeah.
I fit culturally probably in a little different context as far as what my preferences are.
Yeah.
But I understand where we are, and I'm going to contextualize to that to the best of my ability.
Which is why we started looking for a space and why we moved to Sunday mornings, because after 9 years of meeting Sunday nights where we thought that maybe we'd be able to reach some people that wouldn't otherwise go, we realized that even in West Texas, the people who don't go to church believe that church happens Sunday mornings.
Yep.
And so we thought, man, if we're going to reach these people, we got to start meeting Sunday mornings.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And then once we moved to Sunday mornings,
It was crazy.
yeah, we grew from 40 people.
Which was us contextualizing to the culture that we're in.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, I'm not going to say a mandate either, but I think is an important part if you are going to plant a church is to
There's
understand
some
where
wisdom.
you are. Yeah.
There's some wisdom.
And it shows
to it.
intentionality with it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, the more that we're talking about this, I haven't thought a lot about church planning. I think about it every now and then when people bring it up. But you're right. The way that I was taught growing up was this is a mandate. This is what you do. This is what just happens. People are built up and trained within the church to go do these things, which isn't, like we said earlier, it's not wrong.
Yeah.
But the more that we talk about it, the more I realize that I spent a lot of time actually thinking about it in high school and college. I guess I just pushed it away. But it seemed to me as I was taught those things, which is all the things that we've talked about now, is that church planning is basically just opening a new franchise.
Yeah.
Like they felt like I have a form that works.
Yeah.
I figured out a good system. Let's bring the system over there, which in itself isn't wrong. But if the goal is strictly that and not meeting a need for the sake of the gospel, then I feel like you're missing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think to even not combat, but add to what you said earlier, people will rush into, because they feel like it's a mandate, they'll rush into finding leaders. I could be completely wrong about this, but I remember I've when we would travel and play music, we would try to go to different churches on Sunday morning and stuff like that. And there would be times where they would talk about the church plant that is currently happening or going to happen, and they would talk about the leaders in place. And I remember several times what it felt like was, here's somebody who loves the Lord and would be brilliant as an elder, but we don't have a spot for him here. Now let's just make a church so that he can be an elder. Let's go open up a new church so that he can do this. And that still feels misguided.
Well, you saw that?
I did, yeah. There's like they had brought up, they didn't say it explicitly, like, well, I can't find a place to make him here, but they I didn't know the guy obviously, but they built up this man and this family and just talked about how great how hospitable they are, how much they hold tightly to the word, how great of a teacher they are, how they want to shepherd, and how now because we have him, we're going to go do this. That's how the whole presentation felt.
Okay.
So it felt like because we have this great guy, they didn't explicitly say we don't have room for him here. That was one of my first thoughts, was like, well, hire him. Like, this guy sounds great. Bring him on the team.
Yeah, it sounds like more so they recognized that they wanted to be in a different part of a town. Was it town or another town? That same town or another town?
I think that was a Metroplex area, so it was a different town, but it was like 10 minutes away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there is a positive aspect of church planning from that regards. What you're saying, I actually like that, where maybe you as a church, local church, recognize, man, it seems like there's a need in this other part of our town or another community. We have people that are qualified and equipped for this. We've invested into them
Let's go
the
meet
way
that
Paul
need. Yep.
and Timothy did. So let's send them out to go meet the need in this place.
Yeah.
I like that idea. I would love total opinion and preference. I think I would love to see more of that happen from good churches, because then you're taking the same heart and like model, if you will, from these good churches, solid churches, and you're planting it in these other areas.
Yeah.
The one thing we got asked about all the time, Ryan, when we planted was, there's so many churches in San Angelo, why do we need another one? Ryan was really gracious about it. I would just say, because there's not very many good ones. And that was part of the need we saw, that we felt like we needed to meet, was like there's not a lot of churches in San Angelo. There's some, but there's not a lot that actually preach the scriptures and put Jesus as core.
Yeah.
And so that was a need in this giant town with a whole lot of churches. There's not a lot of Jesus.
Yeah.
So that was a need we were trying to meet. So I like the idea of sending people out into the community or other communities with that goal.
Yeah.
But just not the idea that it has to, like, it's a mandate. I love the idea of church planning. I think where my struggle comes in the conversation is people who say this is a must.
Right.
Now, if someone wants to say it's a must because we're trying to reach the world with the gospel, and as the gospel spreads, there's a necessity for churches in those areas, I'm
Agreed.
in.
Yeah.
I'm in.
Agreed.
But I'm talking, most people, when they say they're planting a church, they're planting a church within the U.S.
Yeah.
or somewhere in a settled, I'll say this way. I would feel different about someone saying we need to plant more churches in unreached people groups.
How about this? plus and minuses to something like the Acts 29 network.
Yeah.
So the things that people go, well, I'm planting a church through Acts 29, or I'm planting a church. I don't know a whole lot of the names of the different umbrellas, but like pluses and minuses on those things. What do you think?
You mean like pros and cons?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
What's
I've never heard somebody say plus and minuses, so I didn't know if you were talking about like adding churches and taking away churches, or like
what's the good about that?
I don't know enough about it, to be honest with you. My that was my first thought when somebody had brought up like, well, who are you guys accountable to? I think about those systems because I don't know.
Yeah.
But it seemed like when people have talked about it before that like we're planting underneath this, and then that network is helping them assisting them in getting it started.
Or we're using their guidelines and their structure.
But also there's a level of accountability seemingly with it as well. Again, I don't know 100%, but it seems like this network is making sure that you're staying according to these standards. You're doing whatever according to their form or their structure or their curriculum
theology.
Or their theology. Absolutely. So you're still accountable to them. And then seems to be, again, I don't know if this is Acts 29. You guys correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to be there's a point where it's like, okay, now you're good. Now you can be autonomous, or you just remain in the network.
Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So it's Acts 29, I believe, functions a little bit more like a denomination.
Oh, okay.
In that regards.
Gotcha.
Don't hold me to that. I don't know that for sure. But what I mean is like if you're part of the Acts 29 network,
Mm-hmm.
there are some things that must still be in place. Like I imagine if your theology shifted,
Mm-hmm.
that you wouldn't be able to stay part of the Acts 29 network. Like
Gotcha.
if whoever's, I forget who's running Acts 29 now. Is it still Chandler?
That's the last I've heard.
think
It
so.
went from Driscoll to somebody else, and I think Chandler was the one. I don't know where it is now. But like, I imagine if whoever's overseeing the Acts 29 network found out that you were teaching something contrary to what they believe, I imagine they would be like, hey, you can't be part of the
this
network
anymore.
anymore. Yeah, because it's the intention's a network. So the pros of it, I think, is that you have some support, and that you're able to like have people help you through the process. Church,
Yeah.
we've done this. Church planning's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, church planning is not as hard as like what would they call church revitalization, where you go into a church that has like an established culture, and then you're trying to like
Change
bring it
all
back
that.
to life. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there are some people who would say that's easier too. I feel like church planning was easier, but it doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, you in essence go in with nothing,
Mm-hmm.
And so what those networks provide is a really positive support as you plant, where you don't feel like you're on your own. And some accountability in the sense of like, theology, like in how if you're part of that network. But what's interesting to me is that, we view those as different than denominations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think it's a whole lot different than the intention of what most denominations do. Granted, they all run a little differently, but those networks are the same. So like we know people in the Redeemer Network,
Mm-hmm.
and there are some stringent things like their form. Almost every Redeemer church, I believe, has a similar form
Mm-hmm.
in how they do discipleship and how they do small groups and how they some of the theology they have even as well. So I think that there's some requirements for consistency amongst those things. So I think the positive is the support.
Mm-hmm.
Negative, I would think, Ryan, would be like having to adhere to a form. And I'm only saying that negative because of me. I'm not saying that's my
That's
opinion.
what I was thinking.
I think a lot of people might think that it's a positive. For me, I'm like, I don't really want to have to stick to a specific form. I would love to have some autonomy in that.
Well, we've said from the beginning that we don't ever want to be bound by a form.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that we don't utilize form,
Sure.
but we don't want to be bound by a form.
No. So I think that where that could get tricky, is when you take a form from a place like the United States, and you mentioned this earlier, Ryan, and you're trying to plant a church in India or Southeast Asia. You can't replicate that form,
right?
No.
Or at least a lot of it. Maybe pieces of it you can. Like you can replicate, like we're going to teach together, we're going to meet each other's needs, we're going to sing together, those kind of things. But like even the form of those things might look different than it looks here. And so the hard part is like you can't replicate. So like when someone says like, "Hey, here's the way to plant a church," you can't make that a universal principle because it's going to look different in different places you plant. I don't even think within the U.S. you can say, here's what it looks like to plant, because
no way.
Different areas are going to look way different. And even within a town, like there might be certain parts of a town that it looks like, in San Angelo, like planting a church on the north side of town. Well, if you're being authentic and you're planting a church where most of the Hispanics in town live, it probably needs to look a little different than if you're at a mostly white church. I'm just saying, just being honest about it. So like you shift. I mean, I think there are churches in San Angelo who were established long before the culture changed in their neighborhood, and some of them have done a good job of like reaching that neighborhood, and some of them haven't. But it's a difficult thing to say like, here's how you do it. You have to follow this model. I think what you can say is, here's some biblical principles, ideas, wisdom, things that you can implement in church planting that will be a benefit and help. But to say like here's a form you have to follow is difficult, I think.
Let me ask you this question. Let me read this statement to you. The church is at the very center of God's cosmic purpose and is his appointed means of spreading the gospel. I mean, I feel like...
Say it again.
The church is at the very center of God's cosmic purpose and is his appointed means of spreading the gospel.
Okay, can we talk about those two separate statements? I don't know what they mean at the center of his cosmic purpose, because I feel like Jesus is, and the church is part of the story.
Yes.
I'm not sure I'm comfortable saying that they are the center.
Yeah.
I think Jesus is the center. I think
that's a strange way to say that.
I think that I think it's clear that God's going to graft Israel back in.
Yeah.
As a nation, as a people. And so like to say that they're separate from that. I know that Jews now there's now no Jews or Greeks. Like it's the Jews are part of people of faith are all part of the same body of Christ now. But it's just weird to me to say that they're at the center. I don't know what they mean. I might agree with them if they explained it, but that statement alone feels strange. As far as the other one, I mean, I don't know if I innately have any issues with that. The second part?
Yeah. I mean, so again, I feel like I'd have to ask a lot of questions, but Ephesians, the church being the mystery of God, you know, that the Jews and the Gentiles would come to faith. Anyway, I'm just looking at some stuff. This is the Lausanne Covenant or something like that. It's what the Acts 29 model is based on. It comes from 1974. Anyway,
Driscoll's way older than I thought he was.
But one of the things I was just looking at, Acts 29, their website talks about what they believe. It says that they follow that covenant. I've never heard of that covenant, so I pulled it up. They also had Church Planting Sunday, which was April 16th this year. And they say that they believe that church planting, it says Acts 29 exists to plant churches worldwide by recruiting, assessing, training, and supporting church planters.
Cool.
So that might explain like why that's such a fundamental part. So if you plant under Acts 29, part of your form is we want to plant more churches.
It's fine with me.
Yeah, totally fine. It's just,
I think maybe where it might feel like where there's tension, which is not, is like, I don't actually have any issue with that. I also don't have any issue with a church that doesn't plant another church.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of a biblical model where a church plants another church. Can you?
I mean, I think Paul and Barnabas were sent.
They were sent to preach. And the result was that churches were planted.
Yeah.
But I can't think of a place where they were sent for the purpose of planting a church. I agree with you. You could make the argument that was in the heart of the people, but I think
sure.
I think, like it says, they said, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. And after fasting and praying, they sent them off, and they went down from there to Seleucia and then to Cyprus, and they arrived and they proclaimed the word of God in the synagogues. They had John to assist them. So they're going through the synagogues and proclaiming Christ. They're bringing the gospel.
Yeah.
The result, absolutely, is that churches were established.
Okay, so maybe how we need to talk about that is that,
again, I don't have any issue with people planting churches.
Right. How we need to talk about that is what we call church, when we say planting a church, is we're actually talking about an organizational structure.
Right.
What seems to be the case, like with Paul and Barnabas, is that they're going to preach Jesus to people who have not heard the gospel of Jesus, right?
Yeah, and then an assembly develops.
Right. And so out of that, there's this necessity for them to be together, because this is how we're like built. This is how we're ingrained. The Spirit
and all the other people in your
and,
community are idolaters.
Yeah. And so now we're meeting together because there's benefit, and it's how we're supposed to do, like as fellow believers in Jesus. And so they begin to meet together out of necessity.
Yeah.
And so maybe where we should talk about it is like, maybe what actually we're talking about is not
the same thing.
Yeah, because we're talking about planting an organizational structure rather than the gathering of the believers. So I'll say this, I don't mind the gathering of the believers.
Yeah.
Like if you want to like go somewhere and have a new gathering of believers,
a
new assembly of believers, great. Maybe my struggle is within that idea saying it has to have this form, because that's really what we're doing with church planting. Is like modern day church planting is a form. As an example, if you go to seminary now and you study church planting, there's two basic models. There's the attractional model, which is like big show and lights, and you rent a bunch of sound equipment and have it set up at like a school or an auditorium or something, and try to get a bunch of people there. The other one, I forget what it's called, but it's like how we did it, where you just like start meeting in a living room. Yeah. Those are like you will learn about those two church planting strategies if you study it in seminary.
Yeah.
So we've like categorized the forms.
Yeah.
So like when we talk about church planting, we're literally just talking about a form.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying those are wrong to talk about. I just am saying like,
well, there's a practical side to that, right? There's a practicality
to have some kind of form. I'm wondering if like maybe we've gotten so caught up in the form that we forget the intention.
Well, there was a guy that I know many years ago that planted, and he planted through Andy Stanley's ministry, I think. And Andy Stanley's ministry told you what the lobby needed to look like, what kind of coffee to serve, the TVs that needed to be there, what the lighting, how it needed to feel like when you walked in the door. But they also set rules like within maybe a year, you had to have like $100,000 in the bank. You had to, like, there was a lot of things. And if you didn't tick all the boxes, then they would remove you from their umbrella, right? Because the form wasn't an Andy Stanley church.
Did you have to pay a percentage to them?
I don't know.
Because it sounds like a business model.
But
franchising.
But what was interesting to me is this particular church that I knew, when they didn't meet all the requirements after a year, they shut their doors instead of just continuing to meet, but not being an Andy Stanley church. Yeah. Right?
It's because he said he's not a teacher.
Right. But like, it broke a lot of people's hearts.
Well, it's because he was in the situation. I think everybody knows what we're talking about. So he was in the situation where he was doing it because he wanted a form, not because he felt like he was someone who was qualified. You cannot say you're qualified if you can't teach.
Yeah. Right. It's interesting though. I think there's so much emphasis put on form, more emphasis put on form. I wonder what it would be like for us as a church to be like this church in Antioch, this assembly. I know we've talked about using the word church because culturally it makes sense, but I am having more and more struggles with it because of the ideology that comes behind it. Like, I just feel like I want to say assembly more and more often, but at least in our conversations I can, and on this podcast I can use that. So I wonder what it would be like for an assembly of believers like the assembly in Antioch to commission people and say, go and proclaim Jesus. And then to see out of the overflow of that, they have to go back through now and train some people, because an assembly forms in these communities that they've been ministering to, and they go back and they spend time training them and equipping them.
I actually feel like that's the model we should take.
I agree, because I think what we do is we have this mindset, you've got to go, instead of equip the people that are there to know Jesus and to reference Jesus,
Yeah.
And I'm not ever going to be mad about whatever form people use if Christ is proclaimed.
Yeah.
Use whatever heck form you want to, but to me, I resonate. I like that model of, look, man, you feel called to move. Like, I'll tell you guys, and I know we've joked about it, moving the 456 to Colorado, but I I really have an affection for the Northwest, not politically. The political climate there stinks.
Yes.
But
It's because you grew up going to Oregon,
yeah,
right?
but my dad was raised in Oregon, and every summer we'd go up to Oregon for a few weeks, and I learned to fish there. I learned to shoot there. I camped there. I remember walking the trails and eat. Like I have a big affection for Oregon specifically. And if we're home, like Michelle and I are home, our kids are home, we're here, we're in this county and we're going to be here. But like, how interesting it would be to just have somebody go, man, my family and I feel like we want to go to Oregon, and we want to go there and just start sharing. Oregon, Washington State is less than 15% Christian. We want to go there and just be examples for Christ. And then at some point down the line, they're like, man, we've got 10 people meeting in our living room. And then at some point down the line, they're like, man, we got 20 people meeting in our living room.
I'm not innately opposed to the attractional model. Let me just say that.
Yeah.
I feel like what you just talked about seems to be what happened.
It is what happened. Often.
And so again, I don't think it's wrong to do the attractional model.
Yeah.
I feel like I prefer what you just talked about.
Yeah.
Because it seems like that's the pattern that it has been.
Yeah.
The reason I'm not opposed to the attractional model is because it could be made, you could make an argument that it's contextualizing within the culture.
Yeah.
But I think that there's some difficulties that come with that because you have explosive growth up front. So if you have a group of leaders that aren't ready for that, to be able to manage that, then you're going to have struggles. So like, here's my thought with the future of Oregon. We've joked about the Colorado thing, but like if we continue to build into more men who can teach here at the 456, who knows in the future, 20, 30 years, what it's going to look like. Like maybe your boys move to Oregon. You know what I mean?
Michelle,
and you and Michelle follow them because, you know what I'm saying? Like you and Michelle follow them later because that's where they are and that's where their families are and their kids are. And the idea isn't that you're just leaving the 456. The idea is that you're moving there as part of the 456. And then maybe you start meeting with people there. You know what I mean? Like, so that's what I mean is like the pattern is that we continue, which we have to be incredibly diligent in now, investing into and training other men who are also able to teach so that they continue to follow in that role. Like people have asked me recently, like, why don't you guys have more elders? Partly because I told them, I was like, it's on me. Partly because I'm so like cautious now after what happened last time that like in my mind, the standard is crazy high. It's not just that you're qualified, it's that you also fit our perspective of ministry. And so are there people at the 456 that are qualified? Yeah. Is it a process now of moving them into that position? Yes. And I'm not going to rush it because well, I'll tell you this up front. I don't freaking care if people think that they like our organizational leadership structure or not. Yeah. It is what it is. Yeah. I feel like it's fine biblically. We are qualified to fit in this role. Yeah. If someone's bothered by our age or our lack of education, again, I'll say it. You should probably go to another church because we're not changing. And I'm not going to bring someone on board on our elder group just so that we can tell other people we have someone older and higher educated. Like that's dumb. Yeah. But I do think it means we need to be diligent and continue to train other people that are qualified.
Yeah. And that's something we've started talking about a lot more in the last couple months, the three of us, like what that looks like to multiply that.
Yeah. And we're going to do it. And I think maybe it's because I'm like really tired now, but like I find that I have like, what's below zero for patience? I have that for people who want to tell me we don't have enough accountability. I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, you already explained it. Like they have grown up in a system or a structure where there are committees and that everybody has the checks and balances of committees, which is an unbiblical model. But because it's the one that they are accustomed to, they believe that that's the only means by which accountability is provided.
Right. And I'm curious as to what that is. Okay, so like for example, we have a finance team and we've said this, even though the brunt of the weight of decisions doesn't rest on the finance team for the church, it still rests on the overseers, the elders. If the finance team told us as elders, hey, this is a bad idea, we're not going to do it because we've asked these people to be there because we trust them.
To advise us.
So if someone wants to know, is there financial accountability? Yes, that's there. That's what I mean is like, I have less than zero patience for people who are dogging on us for that.
It's amazing to me too, that like, we all three have experienced, and Micah, you and I maybe more so than Pierce, just because of the amount of churches we've preached and spoken in and stuff. But like, it's amazing how many people on committees are running the show who are not godly people, who have no godly character.
And why are people more comfortable with that than three guys who are in the process of of putting more people in place for leadership who are qualified and able to teach and able to lead well, who are themselves qualified, who you can listen to everything they say and you can make a judgment for yourself on where they live. Like, why is that less weight to you than stupid people who sit on a committee who don't know jack about the Bible? Or deacons, deacons who can't even give me a biblical description of anything. I like to mess with them. I'll be like, hey, you know what's a requirement for deacons to drink? Because Paul says that you can't be addicted to much wine. How are you addicted to much wine if you don't drink? So you guys gotta drink. And they're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And I want to be like, you're an idiot. Stop it. I don't think deacons are idiots. I think the form we've put on deacons. Like it shouldn't be, I'll say this, it's the leadership's fault. They shouldn't be putting these people in place as a checks and balances in the role of what's supposed to be a servant.
Servants. Yeah.
Now, if you want to talk about elders, overseers, what I mean is the same thing by that. It's an interchangeable term. Elders or overseers, that's a different thing. There's a qualification for that, and there's a qualification for servants, I think, as well in that form, but or what we call deacons. But I think I'm just at that point where I'm like, listen, for years, people told me and you, Ryan, you guys will never make it because you're doing the wrong model of planting, or you're not doing it right. It's not growing. Like, we've had people for years saying you guys will never make it. I don't know what make it means.
Yeah.
I feel like that's probably, like, they probably wouldn't say that to us now, but now it's like, okay, you guys have made it, but like, you're not doing the leadership right. And I'm like, come on, people.
Well,
like,
the thing I think that maybe bothers some people about the three of us, maybe, is I don't know that the three of us have a lot of ambition for a form or a structure or a big space. We have ambition and desire and drive that people would know Jesus correctly.
Yeah.
And so if this new building that we're building and whatever, and we go, instead of going from 280 people down to 20 people, what we would do is we would keep going.
Yeah.
Because that's what we did for almost a decade.
Yeah.
And to us, the success wasn't ever measured by the number of people sitting in my living room, or the setup and tear down at College Hills in the evenings, or the borrowed building that Glen Meadows let us use. Like, success and failure wasn't ever based on the number. It was based on the lives that we were seeing change and the people who were coming to understand Christ better and live that out more. What's super funny is, yes, for 9 years, we bounced between, well, for the first 4 years, we were about 20. And then for the next 5 years, we bounced between like 40 and 60 pretty regularly. But what people don't know is that we would have a turnover about every 2 years. We'd lose 4 or 5 families every couple of years who were military, who were moving on, or finished college and moved on, or their job transferred them or whatever. And so we have people all over the place who still keep in touch with us. Rickard Stanley's been gone for 8 years and still supports the church. He's up in Michigan. He and I will talk, not as often as we used to, but he called me 2 weeks ago and was just like, hey man, I'm teaching something at Bible study tonight. I wanted to bounce this off of you before I taught it and just pick your brain a little bit. And so we taught for about an hour, and like, we still do that, you know? So I don't know. I don't really care if people feel like we're successful or not, because the metrics that they're using, I don't think are biblical metrics.
I think what it is now, maybe why the experience has changed for me from you guys won't be successful to you're doing it wrong with this leadership structure, is I think because people recognize in their view of success, not mine, not yours, in their view of success, we're successful. So now there's another reason we got to go at you. Like, I think because it's a non-traditional model that is people are uncomfortable with, they don't like some of the things we do or some of the things we say. And so they're looking for a way to discredit us.
So before I ever even met Michelle, I had written the book Love Notes, and people would say, you're too idealistic. Marriage can't be that good. When you get married, you realize you're wrong. So then I got married and they said, have you realized you're wrong yet? I'm like, no, it's been a great marriage. And they're like, well, it's because you're newlyweds. So then they came back to me later and they're like, now does your marriage suck? And I'm like, no, it's still really great. And they're like, well, now you're just a liar. And so at every stage,
it's a personal justification.
Yeah,
people,
absolutely.
Yeah, people want to feel like they're still one up in you to some degree. And you know what's funny is, like, none of the three of us are trying to do that. So even like with the conversation of church planting, like, we're not trying to say we did it the right way.
No.
What we're trying to say is, like here's, or
it
at least
suited us.
Yeah. It was how we did it for a specific reason, and we changed through the years.
Yeah. And you and I were both, Micah, traveling back then, and that was going to be the primary source of our income. You were still leading worship at your dad's church. That was going to be the primary source of your income. And so we built it kind of for it to be
it was a necessity.
Yeah. And we built it kind of to have some slow growth and some slow progression, because I wasn't ready to come off the road at that point. I had no interest in, I loved traveling and preaching, and you weren't going to leave your dad's church at that point, and you weren't going to come off the road at that point. Like we both felt like those were things that God had called us to and placed us in. And so those weren't going to be things. And thankfully we did that, because that's how you got to know Pierce. And like it's,
and I don't think either one of us were ready then for where we're at now.
No.
I think that it was a process too, where God was shaping us and molding us. So I think that there's some grace, I think, in the church planning. Like maybe that's one of the pros of the network is you have a lot of resources of people to help you like learn and grow through that. Because it's you. I'll say this: you can't graduate seminary and innately know how to shepherd a church.
No,
it doesn't work. Now, if you were in seminary, like underneath somebody learning, being part of somebody else's ministry, I could see that. Yeah. But like just going to school doesn't make you apt or equipped to be someone in leadership, an overseer at a church. And
well, and some people, like, again, I don't know any others than Acts 29. I've known several people who
Redeemer. You know Redeemer.
Is that a model? A Redeemer's an umbrella?
That's what the vessel is, and that's what Redeemer is.
Oh, okay.
Where Ryan is. No.
I thought they were Acts 29.
Oh, they are? I thought they were Redeemer. Because I know they use each other. I'm pretty sure they're Redeemer.
Okay. I didn't know that Redeemer was a different umbrella.
Yeah.
But here's what I love.
Oh, you mean you think it Redeemer's Acts 29?
I thought so.
Oh, it could be.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sorry, I thought you were.
But I don't know. So, but here's what I love. What I love about it is that there are resources available, and there are people who can help. So I think that some people have this heart to plant a church, which go for it.
Yeah.
And I think that some people, I'm an artist. I'm a writer. I'm not. I follow all the stereotypes. I am not very organized, I'm not interested personally in somebody else's system.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But for the people who need the system, there are a lot of beautiful resources out there of people who really love Jesus.
Yeah.
Also, though, if you're more like Micah and Ryan and Pierce, you're like, look, it was a little more organic, a little bit slower for us, which is why a lot of people, because I do think there were people who were taking shots at us. I know there were people who were taking shots at us early on. I think that there are other people who were worried about us because they were like, man, you guys have such a really cool thing going on. Like if you did it a different way, you'd be more fruitful. I think that's what what I mean?
What they mean is bigger.
Yeah.
We'd have more people is what they meant.
Yeah. Because then you can reach more people. You can do more.
If that was the goal, we would have taken jobs at big churches every time they asked us.
Yeah. And so it just wasn't what suited us.
No.
It wasn't our direction.
No. And that's something too, maybe with another thought with church planning is I think there's an essence where it's going to take on some personality from the person that's
how could it not, right?
And so I think it's totally fine. Like,
yeah.
I don't think you should try to be somebody else.
No.
I'm not going to say it's wrong. I don't like the idea of any kind of church planning network. So your church form needs to look exactly like this.
Right.
Because I think it doesn't leave any leeway for contextualizing into the area you're in or the personality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question for you guys, and we don't have to dive super into it, or you can just readdress some of the stuff we've already talked about. But when myself and Kenny came on board years ago, there was part of the conversation, I don't know how deep in the planning it was, but part of the conversation was eventually you two will go off and form another 456 or whatever, and Ryan and Michael stay together, then Pierce and Kenny will stay together. And the heart was still there originally, but we're all going to be continually training men up, which we've already talked about before, that we have that heart to train men up to be teachers and elders and be qualified to do those things. But was there a shift for you guys where it was like, oh no, we don't?
I think it's because you guys had told us that. Like when you came on, you said we would love to have this on our resume for wherever we go next.
Oh, really? What I remember was being terrified that was brought up because I was like, I don't want to leave here. I don't like that. So maybe it's Kenny.
Maybe it was somebody said that.
I got you.
Like one of you two said that.
I was like, I don't know if I signed up for
why
that.
we talked about that.
I got you.
That way.
Well, also I think like I tend to be a dreamer. Again, artist, writer. I tend to be a dreamer. Like, I think we're having similar conversations now. I think we want to retain you, you know, obviously now, but like we're
so
sitting.
back then it was you just wanted to kick me out.
I know I was tired of you. But I think that there is, from a practical standpoint, we're looking down the line in 5 years, and in 5 years, if we don't have other people trained up to multiply this, then we've made a terrible mistake.
I think that would actually be the case if there were 10 people.
If we only had 10 people?
If we had 10 people and we weren't doing exactly what you just said, I think we would be... I think,
but we haven't done that well. I think our perspective has shifted.
Absolutely, but and maybe by necessity. But I think that I'm just saying, like, maybe for a good perspective, leadership should have that perspective in general. Yeah. If for nothing else, it was a pattern Paul did with Timothy. Yeah. And then if secondary, what do you do if you die?
Right.
If the church closes its doors when you as the leader die, you've done something, or you haven't done something right.
Yeah, you failed in some area. Yeah.
So I think that's a necessity.
Yeah.
But I think that,
and I look forward to having more of those conversations between the three of us of what that looks like.
And for us, is a little bit of a necessity because there's been so much growth lately. Yeah. And I mean, take it as it is. Like, our heart was never to like be a certain kind of church. Someone asked me recently, I forget who it was, like, I remember who it was. Do you have any worry because the 456 is kind of like the thing church right now? It's like the hip church right now. And I was like, it is? Yeah. I was like, no, because we're not changing. Like, we can build this building and it's not going to make us different. Like, we're not going to be different people. You know,
I still get surprised when people know who we are. Like, I've been trained for so long to have to explain the meaning of the name, and people get super, they're like, the 456? What is that? No, like numbers. Oh, like numbers. I get to explain it all.
I know. I'm sorry.
But nowadays, there's been a lot of times where I'm still shocked by it, but it's been more often than not. People say, okay, well, where do you pastor? The 456. Oh, I've heard of that. And I'm already ready to go to be like,
because we were so small for so long. People are like, oh, what is that? Oh, is that little Bible study you go to on Sunday nights?
Oh, that's a Bible study. I thought you said you were a pastor. My own mom treated me that way for a long. My own mom treated me that way. So if you think you have a simpler view, Mike, in regards to that, then we can jump into it. But I think
a simpler view, where we sounds like we landed is we like the idea of church planting.
Doesn't have to be a mandate.
No.
Yeah. So there's
maybe that's it. My struggle would be making it a rule. Yeah, absolutely. And also helping. I'd long to see within Christians more of the heart of what we talked about, instead of a heartbeat that's like, man, this form really works, I need to focus so much on this form. Just a heartbeat of, man, where's a need we can meet? Like, if there's been plenty of people who seemingly just have it laid on their heart to plant churches. Like, it's just, that's what they want to do. And I think you can kind of check that heart and be like, is it for the sake of the gospel? That's awesome. Let's make it happen. Let's go. Like, whatever that looks like. Are you trying to meet the need for the sake of the gospel? Are you trying to force a form into it one way or another, or are you coming at it from a place of pride? I think that we can keep the conversation going a lot culturally, but I just think in regards to what should the goal be, the goal should be the gospel. Yep. And that form is going to look different in each situation. Absolutely.
Right. They're a redeemer.
Wait, what's that?
The two here are Redeemer Network. That's cool.
But I thought you were saying Redeemer is part of Acts 29.
No, it's not. It's its own thing, and it started in Lubbock in 2007. That's kind of cool.
Neato.
Yeah.
Dope.
It's pretty neat.
That's pretty neat. We'd love to hear your thoughts. I know that there are plenty of thoughts regarding church plantings. And when I say I want to know your thoughts, I'm speaking to you now, listener and watcher. We want to know your thoughts. We want to know, were you in a church that was a plant? Did you help kick off a church plant? Do you have a heart for church planting? Are you new to the conversation in general? We'd love to hear from you. And I'm doing my little ending spiel a little backwards now, but the way that you can reach out to us is at SimplerPod on Facebook and Instagram, as well as we've got polls now on Spotify. They now do some of those things. And so if you want to interact that way, if you're on Spotify, react to that poll at the end of the podcast. But just wherever you are, you can reach out to us there. You can show your thoughts and appreciation or constructive criticism or whatever, wherever you guys are streaming. You can leave a comment and do those things. We'd love to hear from you. You know who else we love? That's Steven.
That's Steven.
We love being at the Garden Audio. We love being able to come in here, set up the phones to record, pull out our iPads and just go, which is nice. It's a huge convenience. And so if you guys want to find Steven on social media, him and his wife are part of our realty team in San Angelo called the 87 Realty Group. Go check them out. Send them love, send them appreciation because Steven's awesome. Steven's great. We really are thankful that we can come in here and do this. And again, we're thankful for you guys being a part of the conversation. Next week, we jump into November. That's wild. As always, keep Christ as core. What could be simpler than that? See you then.